system. I read all of your testimony. I appreciate your counsel, and I especially appreciate the thoughtful scenarios and stress tests noted in Mr. Del Bianco's testimony. Those are precisely the kinds of issues that certainly get our attention. I cannot overstate the importance of freedom of the Internet from government control.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. If you look back across 16 years and 3 different administrations, I think you'll see that our government has protected ICANN and helped it to mature. You might also see that the U.S. cannot retain that unique role forever. And you might also admit that politics today are forcing a discussion to begin on the transition. You've heard complicated concepts and acronyms all morning long. So how about a simple analogy? Think of a car and a driver. So the top-level domain table, think of it as a car. It was designed and built here in the USA in 1990, and the license plate on this car reads IANA, IANA. In 1998, we asked for a designated driver on this car, and we created ICANN to fulfill that role. Then we handed the car keys to ICANN, and giving them the authority to make policies while driving that car, but we monitored what they did and the care of the car. Then in 2009, we figured ICANN was mature enough to be given some independence, and we did that under the affirmation of commitments. But all along, the U.S. government retained the title to that car. The IANA title was kept by the U.S. That became leverage for us to hold ICANN accountable for the symbolic powers that Secretary Strickling mentioned earlier. NTIA's announcement that you're debating today doesn't say what happens to the title for IANA. It doesn't say it at all. It's possible that the community proposal would have NTIA sign the title over to ICANN, but that's not a foregone conclusion. It might be that we sign the title over to an independent multi-stakeholder entity that could then hold ICANN accountable the way NTIA has for 16 years. Now, NTIA's principles for the transition are great as far as they go, but to hold ICANN accountable and to prevent government capture after we sign over the title, we need more than just principles. We have to ask how any proposed mechanism would respond to potential scenarios or stress tests. So back to the car and driver analogy, we can tell our teenagers about the good principles of driving carefully in the winter, but it's a stress test to have them respond to having the car spin sideways on a snow-covered road. In today's testimony, I suggested several stress tests and use case scenarios, and our task is to develop accountability mechanisms that could answer to those tests at least as effectively as the mechanism we have today, the NTIA oversight. So I mentioned stress tests in there, like what if ICANN lacked the financial or technical capability to actually execute its obligations? Who would rescue the route in that case? I gave richer examples in there, like example scenarios 6 and 7 on Internet censorship. Today, censorship happens at the edge of the Internet, where governments can block a domestic access to a website. As you know, Turkey's blocking Twitter inside the country, even though the rest of the world can see twitter.com. But consider a stress test where censorship migrates from the edge of the Internet to the core of the Internet, which is the route table that we're talking about here, that's used by the entire world. ICANN's Government Advisory Committee, or GAC you heard today, they can change their operating procedures at any time. They can change from the consensus they have today to majority voting, which is what they're used to at the United Nations. There were only 61 governments who showed up at the ICANN Singapore meeting, so 31 governments would have been enough for a majority. So let's say those governments advise ICANN that the new TLD.corrupt, the .corrupt top-level domain, must get government permission for any domain that matches the name of a government official. After all, top-level domains already need that kind of permission for city and territory names in new top-level domains. So it seems like a relatively easy matter for them to approve a brand new policy on permission. The question is, what would ICANN's board do in that stress test? If the future board felt very seriously threatened by the ITU and the UN, as Ms. Rossini will warn you in a moment, then it might not have the guts to reject that kind of advice coming from governments. So how could our new mechanism resist that pressure? It should be at least as strong as the present arrangement, where a government with First Amendment in its DNA would reject censorship in the DNS. So I'll conclude by saying most of the questions you've asked today probably can't be answered today. So we have to continue the process of developing proposals, and then we can ask how each of those proposals would answer the stress tests and questions. We can design a new accountability mechanism for ICANN. possibly with independent and external safeguards. And above all, let's be realists about the risks as we head down this road, but let's begin as optimists that we can arrive safely. And I look forward to your questions. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The mechanism for what Mr. Rossini is talking about would have been instructive on the previous panel, this notion that the United Nations might adopt a resolution indicating that it's got an agency that should take over. In today's world, since we do hold the title, we do hold control of the route, any attempt to do that is a non-starter in today's world. It's the post-transition world where we no longer hold that title, that the entities we charge with it have to be strong enough to resist that. So the mechanisms of takeover, I gave you one with respect to the governments changing the way they vote within ICANN, within the institution of ICANN. Mr. Rossini has talked about threats from without, outside of ICANN. And again, both cases call for us to create stress tests that can resist that.
Thank you. Mr. Del Bianco, if I could follow up with another question then to you. If the NTIA role in overseeing the IANA contract is ministerial, minor, and has no real impact on day-to-day operations of ICANN or the Internet, as Mr. Shahade stated, what impacts would this transition really have?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. To call it symbolic, it does not mean that it doesn't exist. Symbolic just means we have to ask another question about what it means. In 2010, after the affirmation of commitments was signed, the then chairman of ICANN told a group in Europe that he viewed the affirmation of commitments as a temporary document that he'd like to terminate. So frankly, it's the fact that we hold the title, the fact that NTIA's supervision is there, that keeps ICANN from leaving the affirmation of commitments, that keeps ICANN honoring the obligations they have under the affirmation. And I'm reassured when the president of ICANN today says that we'll live by the affirmation. We won't quit it because it's working well, and I agree. But he won't be the president of ICANN forever. There's an ebb and flow of powers and pressures in a geopolitical environment. The question is, what holds ICANN to live within the affirmation? That is a symbolic value, you could call it that, but it's quite real and has effect right now. Because the affirmation of commitments was cited by everyone on the previous panel as the real constitution that keeps ICANN truly accountable and transparent to the world.
Okay, let me follow up with another question to you then. What role can the nonpartisan research entities like GAO and CRS play in this process?
Mr. Chairman, a GAO review, similar to what I saw in the Shimkus-Blackburn bill, could explore what these four principles mean, explore what the words multi-stakeholder and open of the Internet. That would be very helpful to get an exploration of fleshing out those terms as we, the community, design these processes. And the GAO might, or Congress might also help to devise these stress tests that I delineated in my testimony. I only put 8 of them in there. We may need a few more. And as the stress tests are put together, the community can then use those to figure out whether the proposals are going to work. I think Chairman Upton said he characterized these bills as something in terms of hitting the brakes. I would characterize it differently. It would be better if GAO helped us to design a crash test for the vehicles that we have to test, as opposed to hitting the brakes on the process.